In last week's video, we toured the scenic streets of Savannah, Georgia, catching a glimpse into its historic atmosphere, going to the flea market, and seeing some really cool old homes as well as a lot of monuments. This week, we're going down about 17 miles down the river to Fort Pulaski, a fort built after the War of 1812 that served the United States all the way through the American Civil War. Join us as we explore the caves and caverns and the gun traverses of this historic fort. Now, on to Fort Pulaski. Hey, Kling Connection followers. Today we're in Fort Pulaski, Savannah, Georgia, the site of a historic Civil War battle, but also much, much more. Shayna and I are going to explore the site, check out the surroundings, and see what's going on. Come join us in this adventure. Fort Pulaski was named after Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish hero of the American Revolution. Construction began in 1829 and took about 18 years to complete, and the fort was built on Cockspur Island, which was mainly marsh. Now, entering Fort Pulaski, we're crossing a drawbridge. Now, obviously, this drawbridge has been replaced. It doesn't seem that old, but there's a moat that goes around it, kind of like a medieval fort. And you have the drawbridge here that would probably be removed up or at least closed in part as part of the second defensive lines. You also have different mounds and things like that inside here. So we're gonna have to check out what those mounds are and you check out what's inside the fort here. But this is, so far, it's a very, very well kept and preserved park and is really in pristine shape.
As we're walking here through the Pulaski Fort, I just noticed the walls here that you can see made with shells, the oyster shells here. So that's what they had available, you know? You can see them all pushed together and made this tight fit. Strong.
The fort was built using approximately 13 million bricks, many of which came from the city of Savannah and were made locally. The fort's walls were 11 feet thick and were thought to be impregnable at the time. The fort's moat was 7 feet deep, and the fort's parade ground was over 2 acres in size. Now, these deluge were used after the Civil War. During the Civil War, this was all flat here, according to the signs. But these would have stored ammunition, prisoners, medical personnel, food, supplies, you name it, would have been put here in protection of a bombardment or an...
This doorway looks ominous, so I'm going to go see what's inside.
Construction cost to the United States government to build the fort were around $1 million in 1829 till about 1847. A young second lieutenant, Robert E. Lee, was in charge of the substances and other planning during the early construction. And construction was done not only by slave labor, but also skilled labor from around the country and government contractors.
I can see more of those shells on the ceiling.
Now, behind me, this would be like the parade ground, the drilling ground, where they would practice marching, loading of cannons, weapons and accoutrement training, all sorts of stuff going on. And this would also probably been a main portion of, just daily activities out front here. But if you notice here, the bushes are pretty high. So some private probably didn't do his job and didn't mow the grass about 150 years ago, and now it's nothing but a big bush.
So this room has the cisterns that they use to filter the water that they would use to drink. Because the Fort Pulaski is surrounded by salt water and fresh water, they needed a way to filter. So they used a filtration system. And this room was used for the filtration system. So they built, the water would run through different filtrations like soil, rock, some of the oyster shells that we did see, and would help them with their drinking water so that they would have clean water to drink for the soldiers that lived here.
Designed by French military engineer Simon Bernard, The fort was part of the third system of coastal fortifications, which were more durable than early forts that were set up after the War of 1812. Now, at the start of the Civil War, a lot of these southern forts were taken over by Southern militia units or early Confederate armies, but they weren't able to hold them a lot. And this is a great example. During the early part of the Civil War, Fort Pulaski fell to the Confederacy. However, about 5 months into the war, they wound up surrendering to Quincy Gilmore, who was a U.S. Army general, into this room. Colonel Olmsted, who commanded the fort, surrendered here into this room.
We ain't Secesh here.
That man is a civilian.
That man is Secesh, and Secesh is all the same, son.
At the start of the American Civil War, Fort Pulaski was claimed by the state of Georgia. After the outbreak of the war, Confederate troops operated in and out of Fort Pulaski from January 1861 till about April 1862. The only battle at Fort Pulaski occurred on April 10th and April 11th, 1862, between Union forces on Tybee Island and Confederate troops inside the fort. Union troops occupied Fort Pulaski in April 1862 and held it till the end of the war.
This is the dark confinement where the Confederate soldiers were held prisoner. You can see the door here.
The cemetery at the fort serves as a final resting place for a diverse group of individuals, including workers, families, and soldiers. Following the Civil War, the U.S. Army relocated the remains of Union soldiers to Beaufort National Cemetery in South Carolina. However, the bodies of Confederate soldiers remained at Fort Pulaski. Notably, there are 13 unmarked graves that hold the remains of Confederate officers known as the Immortal 600. These officers were imprisoned at Fort Pulaski from 1864 to 1865. 2 tombstones are still visible today. One belongs to Charles Howard Selmer, the infant son of Lieutenant Charles Selmer and Marion Selmer, who was stationed at the fort in 1872. The other tombstone marks the grave of Lieutenant Robert Rowan, an officer who served at Fort Greene, the predecessor of Fort Pulaski. This tomb was relocated to the original site of Fort Greene to its current location sometime after Rowan's death in 1800, but before the Civil War.
So during the last couple months of the Civil War, this is where the Confederate soldiers were kept in prison. You can see the prison doors here and the bunk beds where they slept. I found this so interesting. So the blast from the cannons, when they had fired them, actually took like the plaster off of the brick walls here. You could see it actually, like the cannon would shoot and then the blast would take the plaster right off the wall. And you can look down here and see as the other cannons had gone, there's you can actually see from this angle how the plaster just comes right off the wall from those blasts. It's really just a dramatic effect there, you can tell. This will be an example of the heavy artillery that I was just giving an example of. So you can see how this would be pretty hard to maneuver and aim unless you had something that you would pivot it on. And that way, you could aim particularly well. And you would use that on the ground to move around. So it would leave an imprint. As you can see, this is a very large piece of equipment, and so that's how it works. So Sean explained that to me, and now it makes much more sense. Thank you, Sean.
Now, Savannah was a Confederate stronghold until Sherman takes it over at the end of the war. So the troops at Fort Pulaski, they just couldn't get out of the fort to go anywhere. So one of the most famous pictures of all time took place here that included something that would become our national pastime. The New York regiment that was stationed here started playing baseball. One of the most famous pictures in the Civil War of a baseball game being played was right here at Fort Pulaski on the parade grounds where I'm standing now.
So these little openings here in the fort wall are the rifle slots. And those are for pointing near the drawbridge when people are actually coming in towards the fort. So they're smaller than the cannons, but actually to shoot towards the people as they're coming over the drawbridge. So if you come a little bit closer, you can look out and see that you are pointing towards the front of the fort. And that way you're not pointing out towards the backside. A little bit different. I learned that today. Sean has a lot of good information.
As you can see here, this is the opening of the river, and the guns are manned here to face off any naval forces or amphibious assaults that would have tried to come up to the fort. And we're on the top tier of the fort, which would have had just as many cannons as the first level did. Well, we just wrapped up our tour of Fort Pulaski National Monument here in Savannah, Georgia, and we had a great time.
It is full of history. If you have any interest in American history and the Civil War era, come here and check it out. There's so much to see and do, and the Rangers have a ton of information if you have questions. They were amazing.
And don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the channel, and click that notification bell so you never miss another Kling Connection episode.
We love you guys. Thanks for watching. Till next time.